Hello, and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. I have been studying relationships for over 20 years as a couples therapist, a professor, an award-winning author, and as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend. Now, I'm inviting you into this space each week as I dig into some of the toughest and most fascinating relational dilemmas of our time. If you want to discover how to create vibrant and loving relationships in your own life, you have come to the right place. This is Reimagining Love. Welcome to one of our solo deep dive episodes here on Reimagining Love. The topic of estrangement has been coming up a lot in conversations and in my teaching and in my clinical work these days. So I figured it was time for us to devote an episode to this topic. Cutoffs are often talked about in terms of sibling relationships or parent-child relationships, but they can happen really in any of our familial relationships. And this is a huge and tender topic. It's one that I've got a feeling we're going to have to come back to. So today we're going to just dip into the waters of estrangement, knowing that we can't possibly say everything that needs to be said in one conversation. Today, I'm going to do the following. We're going to talk about the dynamics of cutoffs, and then I'm going to offer 3 relational self-awareness questions to explore if you are considering going no contact with somebody in your family. And then I'm going to offer 3 relational self-awareness questions for you to explore if someone in your family is going no contact with you. So speaking to both sides of the dynamic. And also, in order to prep for today's episode, I did this thing that I love to do, which is that I surveyed my audience on Instagram to check in about the experiences that you're having with estrangement. And as always, you showed up. I heard back from hundreds of you, and I'll be scattering those findings throughout this episode. Obviously, this is not scientific research that would pass Northwestern University's Institutional Review Board, but it gives us that kind of finger on the pulse of what's going on. So, because we are covering a lot of important ground today, I have created a companion worksheet for the episode designed to help you integrate what you are about to listen to. If you're already a newsletter subscriber, you're going to just receive that worksheet in your inbox, and we're going to make sure that we include it in the next few newsletters. If you are not already a newsletter subscriber, please head to dralexandrasolomon.com/cutoff to sign up. And then you will receive the worksheet in your email. Okay, so just by way of starting us off, you know that I am a relational therapist. You know that I am trained to work with couple systems and family systems. And this means that I tend toward a more collectivist view of the world, which is counter to the culture I live in, United States culture, which tends to be more individualistic. Collectivistic focuses on the we, individualistic focuses on the me. So I have, a pretty solidly we orientation to the world and to relationships. And my collectivistic orientation is also somewhat counter to a lot of social media, and I would argue even a lot of self-help that tends to just focus on the self. And there's a lot, I feel like right now, of messaging around cutting out toxic people and, dare I say, sometimes even some conflation of boundaries and cutoffs as if those are the same thing. And I would even say that sometimes my approach feels somewhat counter to parts of my own field, the field of mental health, which I think sometimes does become a little bit individualistic, a little bit focused on just the one person and what they need above everything else, kind of a you do you mindset. So I am just naming that as we go in. I know how dynamic relationships are. I know that what feels really true now may not always be true. I know that part of what being in a relationship means is getting to know each other again and again and again. I also know how incredibly real relational pain is. I understand how much it hurts to be mistreated, to be misunderstood, to be undermined. So in this episode, I'm not telling you what to do. I am naming my bias because you're going to hear it come through, but not my bias, but my lean. My lean is toward preservation if there can be preservation. My lean is toward possibility if there can be possibility. And so you're going to hear that. In this episode, I'm aware that a lot of what I'm going to do is invite you to hang in there with me as we explore how you might be able to reimagine this relationship. What possibilities might exist that honor your pain without necessitating total estrangement. So as you listen, I want you to notice if you are finding yourself protesting. You don't get it, Alexandra. I have tried that. If and when that happens, just breathe. Know that I do not know your situation and your context and what you have tried and how it has gone. And if you are the person who's on the receiving end of the cutoff, you might notice a rise of defensiveness or resistance inside of you as you listen. See if you can just get curious about that feeling that comes up inside of you. See if the questions that I'm asking you to reflect on might be able to just land a little bit inside of you as opportunities to stretch yourself a bit, expanding your perspective, planting a seed for you of maybe a new possibility. Okay, now we get to a point that I have written down that's just called big ass caveat. Big ass caveat is while I am for sure here in favor of seeing what can be done to preserve some semblance of connection, please know that I understand that cutoffs are unavoidable in some situations. One of those situations is when there has been or is abuse that is unacknowledged, unattended to, not being worked on. Clear as a bell, clear as day. Another situation is self-preservation. Some estrangements are rooted in a family member's refusal to see or accept or celebrate your identity, your choice of who you love and how you love. It reminds me of a James Baldwin quote that I'm sure I have referenced on the show before. We can disagree and we can still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist. So that's where the buck stops, isn't it? I also think about my friend Chris Rose, who is one of the two founders of the pleasure mechanics. She uses this expression, queer wisdom, which is the wisdom to not stay in spaces when you are unseen and where you are unsafe. So that's big ass caveat. And again, not here to tell you what to do, just here to invite you to sit with possibilities and frameworks that perhaps you haven't considered. Because family is so central and because family is so important, it is understandable that there is quite a bit of stigma attached to estrangement. We don't have a ton of data about estrangement, but there is some research from the University of Cambridge, for example, a study that was done with over 800 respondents. And they found that 68% of people in this study agreed or endorsed the idea that estrangement carries a stigma. That stigma is about judgmental opinions and assumptions that people make about fault and blame. That stigma is about a contradiction that exists between expectations of family life and then the reality of family life. This idea that blood is thicker than water, regardless of what's happening inside that family system. And then the stigma is also about a lack of people's understanding or a lack of people's lived experience of estrangement and cutoff. And I think that hard things are made harder when it feels like we are swimming against the current. So in addition to the feelings of anger that come with being on either side of a cutoff and the feelings of grief that come with that, there can also then be this layer of shame and this layer that people don't get it. And sometimes psychologists call this disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is when we go through a loss that is not kind of like culturally held, culturally valued, culturally understood. You've lost something in your life or someone in your life who was important, but it's somehow not considered valid or it's not recognized by others, or somehow the way that you are grieving is not considered culturally appropriate or normative. So that's why that I want to say early in this episode that I strongly recommend that you work with a therapist, somebody who's specifically trained in how to work with family systems before you cut a family member off, or the very moment that somebody in your family lets you know that they might be cutting you off, somebody is pulling away from you, that is the time to bring in a therapist. And I want you to bring in therapeutic resources, despite the fact that this very same data I was mentioning, this data from the UK, suggests that 80% of respondents felt positively about their choice to go no contact. They reported feelings of freedom and feelings of independence. I still want you to have that support. And I want you to have that support from somebody who's trained to think and work systemically. So if you are the estranger, the one who's cutting somebody off, you might seek help from an individual therapist, right? You might end up kind of working one-on-one with somebody to make a plan or to heal from the fact that you have just stepped away from an important relationship. And so that individual therapist is going to be in your corner. They are your advocate. And that is so good. And that is so necessary. But I also want your therapist to be thinking about your whole family system. I want your therapist, even if they are just your therapist and your therapist alone, to be putting you in the context of your whole family system, even as they are clearly your ally. And I want your therapist, for example, to maybe even be considering the idea of, could there be some family sessions where you invite that person in to have a conversation with them, to try a conversation with a third party there, where you are seeking a kind of understanding perhaps that you haven't been able to find on your own, or an attempt or a vision of a repair. So again, I want you to have one-on-one support if you are the estranger and you are going through this process of creating distance from somebody in your family. But I do want that person, that therapist, to be able to think systemically with you and to be able to just consider, invite ideas in that maybe you haven't thought of yet, or explore with you ideas about what might be possible regarding different kinds of conversations, regarding planting seeds, regarding some middle ground between same old, and total cutoff. Okay, on the flip side, if you are the estrangee, the one whose kid or sibling or parent is pulling away from you, I also want you working with a therapist and somebody who thinks in terms of family systems. Rather than simply helping you grieve the loss of your family member, I would like you to be with a therapist who is helping you consider whether and when and how you could be proactive in exploring the possibility of family work, how you, the estrangee, might take the initiative to say, hey, I know you're taking distance. I know that you are stepping away, but if and when you are ready, will you come to therapy with me? Could we have a facilitated conversation, a supported conversation? Okay, let's talk about the dynamics of estrangement. Here's a quote that I love from a therapist named Kylie Aglias, who wrote a book called Family Estrangement. She says, quote, family estrangement is larger than conflict, and it's more complicated than betrayal. It is entwined in contradictory beliefs, values, behaviors, and goals, and is the result of at least one member of the family considering reconciliation impossible and or undesirable. The cessation of family relations, whether that involves rejection or deciding to leave, can be an inordinately traumatizing experience. End quote. Yeah, incredibly, incredibly painful. We'll hear in a minute some of the language that people on Instagram use when I ask them to describe the experience of estrangement. I was saying before that we don't have a ton of research, but what we do know from the research that we have is that estrangement is common, and it is probably more common today than it was 10 or 20 or certainly 30 years ago. There's a national study that gets cited a lot that indicates that 27% of people are estranged from at least one family member, and 10% are actively estranged from either a parent or a child, and 4% from their father, and 2.5% from their mother. When researchers ask about the length of a cutoff, that length ranges from 6 months to 30 years. And research indicates that cutoffs seem to ebb and flow. People take space and then try again, or take space and then try again. And data indicates that most people report initiating a cutoff while they're in their 20s or in their 30s. From my read of the data, it really does seem clear that there is an actual overall increase in the prevalence of cutoffs. This is an actual increase, not just people being more willing today to talk about it than years ago. I don't know if there's an actual increase within that 20-something, 30-something age group, but I do suspect that there is. I suspect that even among, that kind of like early adult population or group, that there are more cutoffs today than there were, 20 years ago. There's a researcher named Joshua Coleman, and he has data from 1,600 parents whose adult kids had gone no contact with them. And Coleman found that 70% of the estranged parents had a divorce in the past from the other parent. So the kind of prototypical estrangement scenario seems to be an adult child who initiates a cutoff from their father who is divorced from their mother. But again, it can happen in any relationship, but that does seem to be kind of the most common scenario. So that is, a really important takeaway is for if you are a family that is going through a divorce and there's one or more male parents, that male parent is particularly at risk of kind of, being taken out of the system. And that is obviously going to be because of their choices and their behaviors. So it doesn't, not a surprise, right? You've heard me say on the show many times that we do not socialize our boys and our men to be emotionally literate and emotionally attuned. And then they end up paying mightily for skills that they were not offered early in their lives, and their families pay mightily for that. So it is just another reason, for therapy early and often, and emotional literacy early and often with people of all genders, but especially boys and men, so that then if and when a divorce does happen, there's the possibility of maintaining and sustaining and deepening connection with kids or with adult kids. Okay, just a little bit on cultural context. Here again, not a lot of data, but there's some suggestion that if we compared collectivistic cultures, so think East and Southeast Asia, southern parts of Europe, South America, Africa, if we compared collectivistic cultures with more individualistic cultures, think US and more northern parts of Europe, we would see that estrangement is more common in individualistic cultures and less common in collectivistic cultures. Makes sense, right? The individualistic culture is more focused on the me, what I want, what I need, what I deserve, and somewhat less focused on the unit, the we, what this family system needs. There is data from a large international study back in 2010 that was published in the journal Marriage and Family that found that parents in the US have almost twice as much conflict with their adult kids compared to parents in Israel and Germany and England and Spain. And then one last piece of sort of indirect cultural evidence that we can put in here is some 2019 research that suggests that in individualistic cultures, people who violate norms, like social norms, are seen as more powerful than people who abide by norms. And norm violators evoke less moral outrage. When you compare it to collectivistic cultures, people who violate norms are seen as less powerful, and their behavior evokes more moral outrage. So extending that to the topic of cutoffs are certainly a violation of a universal social norm about family, about loyalty, about fidelity, about togetherness. So it's interesting to consider that cultures that are oriented differently might have different relationships to those who violate norms and to just even the possibility of violating a norm. Okay, I mentioned that I had surveyed my Instagram audience. And I was, frankly, a little bit surprised to see how common estrangement was in our community. So if we sort of had said before, it was like maybe a quarter of all people. Well, in this sample, over 70% of people who responded to this survey report being cut off from a family member. And Nearly 90% of people who responded were the estranger rather than the estrangee. Over half of people who responded, which again, it was a couple hundred respondents, so it was, not a small number here. Over half of the people who responded reported that they are estranged from a parent. And it was, interestingly, just about the same number of people cut off from their mom as cut off from their dad. A quarter of people reported being cut off from their sibling, and then a quarter cut off from somebody else in their family. And nobody responded that they had cut themselves off from their kid. So we'll circle back on all that in a bit. Let's look now at why estrangement happens. If we go back to that University of Cambridge data, people were asked, why did you cut off your sibling? And people's responses included things like, we have mismatched expectations about family roles and relationships. There's a clash of personality or values. There's been emotional abuse. There's parental favoritism, or there's been a traumatic family event. Those are kind of the initiators. And then when adult children who are estranged from their parents were asked, why did you pull away from your parent? Their reasons included things like emotional abuse, mismatched expectations, again, about family roles and relationships, clash of personalities, clash of values, neglect, issues that are related to mental health problems, or a traumatic family event. So when we sit with this idea that estrangement is more common today than it was in years past, I think some of this very likely reflects that family members tend to be more geographically spread out today than in earlier generations. And it's a little bit easier to do kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing. The relationships can be a bit more tenuous when there's miles and miles between you. But I think an awful lot of it reflects what I refer to as the role to soul transition. And you usually hear me talk about the role to soul transition in terms of our intimate relationships, meaning that in earlier generations, partners were chosen based on the degree to which they could fulfill a role, the sort of culturally prescribed, patriarchal, culturally prescribed roles. He is a good provider. She is a good caregiver. That's a role-based marriage. And marriage traditionally has been a highly role-bound arrangement. And today, we've moved from that role-bound arrangement to a soul-based arrangement. Today, we crave a kind of soulmate connection. We want intimacy. We want to feel seen. We want to feel like our self is valued, that there's authenticity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think that elements of that very same role to soul transition carry over into our familial relationships as well. Historically, what has bound a family together has been duty and tradition and loyalty and heavily role-bound relationships. In part, has been kind of the glue that has kept adult siblings and adult parents in contact with each other. So if those elements carry less weight today, something has to fill that in. And that is choice. People are wanting to be able to choose family connections, to feel like I'm here because I want to be here, rather than I'm here because I have to be here. If relationships are more chosen than mandated, then people begin to expect more from their familial relationships, and people refuse to settle for or tolerate less. So I have found over my years that the older generation oftentimes feels confused about what the younger generation is wanting or needing. And sometimes this is actual stubbornness. Sometimes this is an actual lack of cognitive flexibility. Sometimes this is actual untreated mental health, untreated addiction. But sometimes this confusion reflects that the older generation was less likely to ever think about what they want or what they deserve in their own relationships with their parents, or even to feel authorized or entitled to question the quality of the relationship they had with their parents. Younger folks have grown up more squarely in the self-help generation, in the therapy generation. Younger folks are becoming more accustomed to naming their pain. Younger folks tend to be more likely to view relationships as things that you work on rather than accept as they are. And younger folks bring that mindset into their relationship with their parents. And this change, I think, has happened relatively quickly, generationally speaking, this change of expectations, this change around therapy and the stigma around therapy. Like, this has been a lot of change packed into not very many years. So in addition to therapy being destigmatized for younger people, there's quite a bit of social media conversation going on about going no contact with members of your family. There are lots of TikTok creators, for example, who are suggesting that you should stand up or walk away in a way that feels empowering, but maybe also is perhaps a little bit intense, a little bit simplistic, a little bit catchy, a little bit either or. And I think there's a way that our world is quite binary around this. Either you have an amazing relationship with your parents or you have no relationship with your parents. Going back to my Instagram data for a moment, my audience is obviously made up of people who are seeking healthier and more connected and more authentic relationships, people who value difficult conversations, who value addressing tender topics. So in that way, it's not surprising that my audience is much more composed of estrangers than estrangees. But this means that you may want or need to forward this episode to an estrangee in your life because they probably are not going to find it themselves. This is also a reminder that the estrangee may very well just not speak this language that you are learning to speak and that you value speaking. They don't have these frameworks in the same way that you have them. I know it is not easy to find that space of grace without self-abandonment or acceptance without tolerance of harm. It's not easy, but it's also not impossible. I remember years ago hearing one of Oprah's teachers, a pastor named T.D. Jakes, and he was talking about the difference between giraffes and turtles. And he was saying that some of us are turtles. We kind of are low to the ground. We see what we see from that perspective, that couple of inches off the ground perspective. Turtles are seeing what they see from that perspective. And some of us are giraffes. Giraffes, hold this bigger, wider, more expansive view. And I suspect that listeners of Reimagining Love are much more likely to be giraffes than turtles. And it tends to be a waste of energy to judge a turtle for being a turtle. It's also, by the way, a waste of energy to resent a giraffe for being a giraffe. If you're a giraffe, you cannot help but see the big, wide perspective. And I think that it is sometimes precisely in radically accepting the reality that we are different. You and I are different. It is in that acceptance that a new possibility for connection opens up. Okay, let me pause here to remind you that there's a companion worksheet for the episode designed to help you integrate all of what you're listening to. If you're already a newsletter subscriber, you will get the worksheet in your inbox. We're going to make sure to include it over the next couple of newsletters for you. If you're not part of our newsletter community, just head to dralexandrasolomon.com/cutoff and sign up, and you will get the worksheet in your email. Okay, so just staying with this intergenerational piece for another moment. If you've been with me for a while, you know that I describe myself as a woman on a bridge. I love to bridge different groups, different positionalities, people with different experiences. And so here I want to kind of bridge the older folks and the younger folks. I would argue that both generations need to work on understanding each other. So, younger folks, you're up first. I want to encourage you to keep your elders in a context. As my friend Dr. Mona Fishbane says, see your parents as your grandparents' children. This can open up compassion for the ways in which your parents are limited and have been wounded themselves. This is not about letting them off the hook, but it is a principle that can perhaps guide you toward a set of expectations that is grounded in the reality in which you live, a reality that has very real limitations. It is often the case that the more you convey a measure of acceptance, the more the other person can convey a willingness to change. Your acceptance lays the groundwork for the possibility of change. Older folks, I want to encourage you to be more curious and less defensive. I want you to lean into this idea that you likely tried very hard, so very hard when you were raising your family. And you likely did not get it all right. Older folks, I also want you to keep in mind that there will never, ever be a level playing field between you and your adult kid. Even if your adult kid has got a kick-ass job and an amazing life and kids of their own, there's never, ever a level playing field. Adult kids psychologically regress in the presence of their parents. And that psychological regression is not the adult kid being difficult or obstinate or manipulative. That psychological regression, that sense of feeling younger on the inside than they actually are, is about the fact that your adult kid was once a little tiny baby under your care. Your adult kid has a nervous system that was developed in their relationship with you. And so even as you perhaps feel powerless in the wake of your adult kid's criticism, even as you feel perhaps powerless in the face of your adult kid's walled offness, just see if you can remember how, for the early decades of your adult kid's life, you were your adult kid's sun and their moon and their entire solar system. So even as you sit with your powerlessness, you're like, I don't understand what my adult kid is asking of me. This is hard. It doesn't make sense. Like, just hold on to the fact that you are powerful. You are powerful because you were their first experience of connection. You were the beginning, middle, and end of their template, for experience. So, as they reach for you or as they rebuff you, it is precisely because you matter so much. Okay, so wrapping up this intergenerational piece, I will say that given the work I do, obviously I am here for all of us working to up-level our relationships. And at the same time, I have a lot of compassion for the older generation that is often genuinely befuddled and actually not particularly well equipped to do this work. There's a lot of catching up to do. There is a learning curve here. And none of us can be understood outside of our context. So I think it's important to name that context, that we're part of a rapidly shifting intergenerational family dynamic thing going on, where family systems are becoming far more democratic, far more relationship-based, and far less top-down and authoritarian and authoritative. And that's all, I think, ultimately a really good thing, but it's a hard thing, and it's a messy thing, and it requires some understanding on both sides. So you're not ever going to hear me talk about cutoffs or good things or bad things, because family relationships are just far too complicated for those kinds of simple answers. What I will say is that a cutoff is a symptom. A cutoff is a symptom of a systemic problem. I will also say that a cutoff is an attempted solution to a painful relational problem. When you cut a family member off, you are saying to that person, this dynamic is no longer tenable for me, and therefore I have to stop participating in it. Although the cutoff may stop you from experiencing ongoing or repeated painful experiences, you're still going to need to deal with two things. One, the emotional pain that led you to decide to cut off this family member in the first place. And two, the relational fallout that inevitably happens when you decide to cut a family member off, including how you handle the holidays, how you handle relationships with other people in the family system. And I say that if you are somebody who is kind of on the precipice of cutting somebody off, I say that because I do want you to anticipate what lies ahead. Yes, there may be relief. There will likely be relief, but there's still going to be pain. You're still going to need to tend to the impact of all of the hurt that got you to this point in the first place. And you're still going to need to tend to the impact that your decision has on the other people in your family system. I say that to remind you that as you sort of stand at this fork in the road, it's not like it's pain on one path and no pain on the other path. There's difficulty on both paths, which means also that there is opportunity on both paths, opportunity for growth, opportunity for wisdom, opportunity for healing on both of those paths. You can leave the relationship and do your work, or you can stay in the relationship and do your work. Also, I'm a little bit hesitant to name this part, but I don't feel like I'm doing my job if I omit this part, so I'm going to say it. I do want to name there is like this kind of sneaky layer, which is the impact that your decision to go no contact has on your relationship with yourself, right? So like the decision is about, I am stepping away from this relationship with my father. But that decision to step away from your relationship with your father also says something to you about you. And it may very well be the case that by initiating a cutoff, what you feel like you are saying to you is, you are worthy of care. But I also do worry that when you initiate a cutoff, what you are saying to yourself is that you are not able to remain grounded and clear and wise in the midst of a difficult dynamic. I worry that a cutoff gives power to the wounded part of you and disempowers the resilient part of you. So please just sit gently with that, and just no matter where that line of inquiry takes you, I do want you to sit with, what is the impact that this relational choice has on my feelings about me, my story about me. Bottom line here is that an emotional cutoff is by no means a quick fix. It is by no means an easy answer, and you are still going to need to tend to yourself and take responsibility for your healing. You know, when I posted on Instagram about this episode, the words from the community, so that you, if you're somebody who's thinking about initiating a cutoff, maybe this gives you some language for what to expect. If you are going through a cutoff, then this will give you validation perhaps of your experience. If you're being cut off, this will maybe open up for you what that other person is going through. The words that were most commonly used in the little sticker responses were, the most common one, frankly, was sad but also liberating and empowering. Sad but a relief. Sad but makes me angry I had to do it in the first place. Sad but freeing. Sad but ultimately clear and simple. That came up over and over again. Sad but. The other word that came up a lot was relief. Also, along with that would be kind of freeing. And then another word that came up a lot was necessary, like this idea that there was no other choice. So the word necessary came up. Hurtful but necessary, tough but necessary. The word liberating was used, great, relief. And then really painful words, painful and lonely, numbing, painful. It makes the holidays hard. Peace, but also grief for the loss of the idea of what family could have been. Someone said hell, being blamed for a rupture that was not mine. Frustrating. Weird mix. This idea of a kind of a weird mix of a lot of feelings. I want to honor the complexity of all of the feelings that came up for people who were talking about what it was like to get to the point where the only choice feels like it is to step away. The bottom line is that an emotional cutoff is by no means a quick fix. It's by no means an easy answer. And you're still going to need to tend to yourself and to take responsibility for your healing. Okay, we're going to move into our final section, which is our relational self-awareness questions. And I'm going to take turns. I'm going to speak first to the estranger, the person who's considering cutting a loved one off. And we're going to talk through 3 relational self-awareness questions. And then I'm going to talk to the estrangee, the person who's being cut off. And I'm going to talk you through 3 relational self-awareness questions. And it's worth noting, only half of these questions are going to apply to you, but I still want you to listen to this whole section because in listening to me speaking to the experience of the other, you may find your perspective expanded a little bit. You may think of something you hadn't thought of before, an idea or a possibility, or it may just open up a little more space inside of you, space for some empathy, space for some compassion. So, okay. Estranger, you're up first. Let's dive in. Question number 1 that I have for you is, who is the collateral damage of this cutoff? For example, if I cut myself off from my brother, now there are cousins who lose touch with each other, or our parents then end up in these tricky loyalty binds. If I cut myself off from my parent, now there are grandparents who lose access to their grandkids. My partner has just lost access to their parent-in-law, and my aunties and uncles are in a loyalty bind. This sounds like a guilt trip. It is not. You likely have already thought of this, and it likely feels quite uncomfortable for you to know that something that you feel like you need is going to create a ripple effect. However, perhaps you haven't thought about this ripple effect. If you grew up feeling unseen or neglected in your family system, you might actually have a really understandable blind spot here. You may not be anticipating the fact that this decision that you are making is going to impact people besides you and the person you're cutting yourself off from. Again, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just inviting you to kind of play a couple of moves ahead. Because pain tends to make us myopic. Pain tends to kind of narrow our vision and lead us to just see the thing that's right in front of us, not the thing that's kind of down the road. So I'm just inviting a little bit of anticipation there. So here are some thoughts I have about what you can do as you sit with this question about collateral damage. If you do decide to go ahead with the cutoff, can you give everyone else in the system your blessing to continue their relationships with the person that you have cut off? Oof, it's so big. I know it's so big. Can you resist the urge to make this a loyalty test, to kind of test the rest of the system? Are you with me or are you with them? I really want to invite and challenge you to be explicit about your blessing. In order to bypass family members sort of sneaking around to spend time together without you knowing so that you don't get upset, because that's likely going to feel really crappy if that happens and you get wind of it. I also want to invite and challenge you to get explicit about your blessing, to prevent people from talking to each other about how are we going to stay connected now and how are we going to not make so-and-so mad, because that's going to also probably feel pretty terrible if you know people are talking about you. So your willingness to offer a blessing for others to spend time together, even as you step away from this person, that has the power to kind of like shrink the blast radius a little bit. And if and when you make the choice to offer that blessing, I want you to feel so freaking proud of yourself. You did what needed to be done for your well-being, and you explicitly gave everyone else permission to be liberated, to handle themselves however they want. That takes a ton of maturity, and it is a powerful way to turn down the heat. Even if there's a part of you that wants everyone to side with you, that's so understandable. I so get that. Just, put your hand on your heart, offer some tender, loving care to that part of you. That part of you is a wounded part. That part of you is a tender part. You can offer comfort and you can offer validation to that part of you who really wants everybody to also turn against this other person. You can stand in the fullness of your reality. You can stand in the truth of your choice. You can affirm yourself. You do not need everyone to prove their love for you by choosing you instead of the other person. Their choice to remain in relation to that person you've cut off is not a reflection of you. Their choice to stay in relation to that person is about them. It's not about you. It's not about your worth. It's not about the validity of your choice. And P.S., a bunch of things can be true at the same time. The cousin that you're cutting off may have been downright awful to you and not so terrible to your sister, for example. And you can like and love your sister very much, but have a different set of values, a different kind of a threshold, a different set of priorities. So see if you can view those differences between you and your sister as enhancing to your relationship rather than threatening to your relationship. And if you do cut that relative off, and if you do give everyone a blessing to continue with their relationship in a way that feels good and aligned to them, then 1, resist the urge to, in this example, ask your sister whether or not your cousin said something about you when she saw them. Number 2, shut down the conversation. If your sister comes to you and she wants to talk to you about what your cousin said about you and about the drama, just shut that down. I know how hard it is, but it's really important to avoid these kind of triangular conversations, talking to your sister about your cousin, letting your sister report stuff to you that your cousin said. Just as hard as it is, redirect them. Honor the fact that you have the urge to get all tangled up in the family drama, and then focus on all the other avenues that you have for connection with your sister. You don't need to connect with your sister around family drama. You have lots of other things to connect with your sister around, I'm very sure. And in fact, if you make that commitment, I will not connect with my sister around drama, then you're kind of forced to nurture and nourish other avenues of connection, right? If you're shutting down the family drama avenue for connection, then you are really forced to kind of open up and strengthen those other avenues of connection. Question number 2, is this cutoff my way of showing with my actions that which is not being recognized with my words? So sometimes we choose an action because we feel like our words are going unheard, our words are being misunderstood, our words are not making a difference. I have trained my brain to pause when I catch myself saying, how can I get them to da 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 da? Like, how do I get my mom to da da da? How can I get my husband to da da da? That is a little like kind of blinking, flashing light inside of my brain now, because that is my effort to control something, right? To kind of like maneuver or use action to create a different kind of an outcome. So check in with yourself. Is your cutoff your attempt to get the other person to ... treat you more kindly, acknowledge your hurt, whatever? Is there an intention with the cutoff? Like, maybe if I cut them off, then they will ... If that's landing for you, then the cutoff is, at least in part, an attempt for you to have your behavior show something that is so far not being adequately conveyed by your words. And I want you to consider what you might do instead. Here are some suggestions. Number 1, could you talk directly to this family member? Maybe in your mind, you're like, are you kidding me, Alexandra? I've tried that. But check in, like, what has the conversation been so far? Yes, you're pulling back. Yes, maybe you've rolled your eyes, but I wonder, just check in with yourself. Have you been clear and direct? Can we please sit down and talk? Can you perhaps express directly to them, I feel hurt. I feel misunderstood. I feel torn. I feel like I'm not sure where to go from here. So that's one possibility. Like, just check in. How direct have you been in your attempts at conversation and dialogue? Number 2, Could someone else help you convey that message? Could you bring in a family therapist? Is there someone in your family, you sort of a wise elder in the family who could perhaps help the two of you speak differently to each other than you've been able to do so far? Third, could you get specific with your ask? Perhaps what you've done so far is you've expressed your criticism, and therefore your family member feels diminished, deflated, and perhaps even frozen. And from that place, your family member is not asking you, okay, wait a minute. You're critical of me. What can I do differently? What can I do to make the relationship different? Hold open the possibility that your family member is perhaps intimidated by you. They are perhaps a little bit of a deer in the headlights. If you yourself are a parent and the person you're cutting off is your parent, then your parent is very likely terrified about the prospect of losing access to their grandbaby. And they are very likely intimidated by you, worried about doing something that's going to make it worse, and therefore saying nothing at all. That kind of frozen deer in the headlights thing. And then understandably, from where you stand, you are interpreting their inaction, their frozen silence, as not caring. I am not justifying their behavior. I want your parents to be picking up the phone, calling a family therapist, figuring out what the heck to do about this. What I am planting a seed of here is that perhaps they are frozen, they are stuck. They know you're mad. They know you're disappointed. They just don't know where to go from here. I've seen it so many times. And I'm imagining it from where you stand. It's like, but I've told them a million times what they're doing wrong. But from where they stand, they feel attacked and misunderstood. And from that place, they're not saying, how can we make this better? Should they be saying, how can we make it better? Of course they should be, but they're not. So what might it be like for you to connect those dots for them, for you to get explicit, for you to get clear, for you to get specific? So rather than saying, you guys are so X, you're so Y, you're so Z, what might it be like to say instead, when we're together, could you do the following things? And also, bonus points for rather than saying, can you guys stop doing this, this, and this? Talk instead about what you want, right? Ask for what you want. It would mean a lot to me if you would, whatever, come over for 2 hours rather than kind of just showing up for an unannounced amount of time. It would mean a lot to me if you would let me bring food over to your house rather than, whatever, serving food that doesn't really go over very well with my family, whatever it is. So can you get specific in your ask? Okay, my fourth suggestion is just making sure that you are hearing yourself, right? If you are feeling unheard and you are feeling misunderstood, just make sure that you are hearing yourself. And then number 5, make sure that you have people in your circle who are validating you, who are hearing you. And perhaps if and as that need is being met elsewhere, maybe then it becomes a bit easier to accept the limitations of this family member because you are no longer going to them to try to get the validation that you are now giving yourself or that somebody else, some other treasured person in your life is giving to you. Okay, question number 3. Is there a shade of gray between same old, and cutoff? You've heard me say that in our relational lives, 180 degrees is very rarely, if ever, the answer. And especially when we are under stress, we tend to see only 2 choices: stay put or get the hell out. And under stress, we might lose sight of all of the creative possibilities that might exist between all and nothing. So I want to offer you some creative possibilities. See if any of them land. If you decide to try one, treat it like it's an experiment. You're just collecting data. You're just seeing if this tweak could make a difference. You are seeking the amount of difference that has the power to make a difference. You're trying to find some, rather than an on-off switch, you're trying to kind of work with this dimmer switch to see if you can do something different enough that you feel different in this relationship. So I'm kind of inviting and challenging you to seek some shade of relational gray between staying stuck, tolerating what you've always tolerated, and cutting off completely. Okay, so here are some ideas. Could you visit for an hour rather than all day? Could you only take a phone call from this relative during the day rather than in the evening, or whatever time of day feels like it is least intrusive and irritating for you? Can you limit the length of that phone call? Literally set a timer on your phone so that you know when the timer goes off, the conversation is done, you get to go back to your life. Can you stay in a hotel rather than in their home? Can you meet in a group rather than one-on-one? Or can you meet one-on-one instead of in a group if it's, a problem that seems to happen largely when you're in a group setting? Can you redirect the conversation? Just have a conversational boundary, right? A boundary and a cutoff are not the same thing. So could you redirect the conversation? Just say, I'm not talking about that. I'm not available for that conversation, firmly and lovingly. These are all ways of you reminding you that you are in the driver's seat. You are not trapped. You have agency. This is especially important if you are considering taking space from a parent or some other elder in your family, because that means that you have had the experience. When you were little, you had the experience again and again and again of not being able to leave. You were wholly dependent when you were little. You were wholly dependent on this person when you were little. You couldn't leave. You couldn't get away. You actually were stuck and trapped and limited, but you aren't anymore. So you have to be creating for yourself that experience of, I have agency. I can drive this where I want to drive this. There literally is some part of your nervous system that remembers the feeling of helplessness. So you have to be active, proactive, and intentional to remind yourself that was then, this is now. Creating experiences in which you feel your power and your agency can help you develop more capacity to stay in the relationship because you feel like it's more manageable. You feel like it's more digestible. You can feel safe even when you are in that other person's presence. One more note on this third question. If you're a parent and you are thinking about cutting off your parents, because you're worried about the impact that your parents are going to have on your kid, I do want you to remember this. A grandparent is far less powerful than a parent. Your kids have something that you did not have when you were growing up in your parents' home. That thing that they have you. Your kids have you. Your kids have you to advocate for them. Your kids have you to validate their experiences for them. Your kids have you to translate your parents' behavior to them. You didn't have any of that when you were a kid growing up with your parents, but your kids have that. You are an amazing resource. By definition, your kids simply cannot have the same experience of your parents that you had, because they've got you. Okay, moving on. Relational self-awareness questions for the estrangee. So if you are the one on the receiving end of the cutoff, here are my self-inquiry check-ins for you. Question number 1, what am I being asked to acknowledge? So your family member is pulling away from you because they are in pain. And even if you cannot imagine feeling the way that they feel, if you were in their shoes, all you actually need to do is believe their report from their part of the world, right? It doesn't have to be that you would feel the way they feel if the tables were turned. All you have to do is just believe their report. Your family member's perspective is different from yours, and their perspective shapes their perception. And their perspective creates the emotions and fuels their urgency to act. So rather than getting caught up in, why is my family member choosing to see it the way they're choosing to see it? Stop doing that. Just drop that question, accept the reality. This is their story. And if you can start from that place, then you can perhaps turn toward your family member's pain and you can begin to tend to that pain. Just paying attention to that pain, listening to that pain, believing that pain because you've stopped questioning why do they feel this way and they shouldn't feel this way. No, let go of all that. Let go of all the chatter about why and what if, and just meet that loved one exactly where they are. They are in pain. Okay, fine. Validating their perspective does not mean that you agree with their perspective. And validating their pain does not mean that they are perfect and you are evil. Validating their pain simply means that you are brave enough to choose the relationship. Couple and family therapists have this saying where we say, you can choose to be right or you can choose to be happy. And that's what I'm asking for you to explore here. So the question that we're sitting with here is like, what are you being asked to acknowledge? And if what you're being asked to acknowledge is that you and this loved one have a values difference or a political difference, see what happens if you approach your loved one with this question. How can you and I protect all of what is good about our relationship from the impact of this values difference that we're struggling with? My favorite question. It's a beautiful question. And if you, as the estrangee, you know, you may not have a lot of moves available to you, but I think that's a really powerful question to approach your loved one and to say, what are the possibilities? How can we protect the rest of our relationship from the impact of this difference that sits between the two of us? It may very well be the case that you have some stuff that you would like your loved one to acknowledge from your perspective. You've got feelings too in this. Perhaps what you want to say to them is, you know what, you and I are different, but I'm not worse than you. Perhaps what you want to say to them is, I've tried really hard in my own way, and I feel like that was never been enough for you. Perhaps what you want to say is that you feel judged by them or you feel misunderstood by them. Perhaps what you want to say is, I don't feel like you're giving me the benefit of the doubt here. Okay, here's the thing. In a relationship, you can't acknowledge everyone's pain at the same time. And if your loved one is pulling away from you, now is the time for you to center their pain, to prioritize their pain. So you are being asked to kind of hold on to your pain. It's valid, it's real, but you're being asked to kind of hold on to your own pain so that you can prioritize and center and really focus on your loved one's pain. And if you can do that, if you can be diligent and patient and empathic about their struggle, exactly as it's showing up right here, right now, today, then down the road, perhaps they can offer that to you. But I can bet you dollars to donuts, you're not going to get there until you do the first thing first. The first thing first is you have to acknowledge your loved one's pain. And then down the road, when they feel heard and listened to and understood and validated, then they might be able to be a bit curious with you about your perspective, about your struggles, about your hardship, about the efforts that you have tried to make over the years. Okay, question number 2. What do I lose by following my family member's lead? What do I lose by following my family member's lead? Here's the deal. Your loved one is in pain. They aren't feeling cherished in their relationship with you, and their desire to pull away from you arises from their hurt, not from a desire to control you, not from a desire to demean you, not from a desire to humiliate you. What is the story that you are telling yourself about what it would mean if you softened, if you appeased, if you redoubled your efforts to be loving or gentle or complimentary to them. Like, what's the story that you tell yourself? Perhaps the story that you tell yourself is that you're weak if you apologize, or you're weak if you acknowledge your shortcomings. And if that's your story, that is totally understandable, because in our culture, we are taught that an apology puts you in a one down position. We are taught that an apology is a loss of face, and that in order to be strong and tough, you got to like save face and never let them see you sweat and don't back down, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm here to tell you from my quarter of a century of being a relational therapist that the ability to apologize is a huge sign of strength. It takes so much courage to say, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. It takes so much courage to say, I'm sorry that you've ever felt anything less than loved or cared for by me. That takes immense courage, immense maturity. It's an incredibly powerful kind of medicine to give somebody in a relationship. Perhaps you're worried that if you give your loved one an inch, if you acknowledge anything, then they're going to take a mile. That if you accommodate this request, then it's going to be a bottomless pit. They're going to move the goalposts. Nothing's ever going to be enough. Da, 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 da. Well, that might be the case. I don't know your situation, but until that pattern has become clear, I wonder what it would be like to give your loved one the benefit of the doubt, to remind yourself that accommodating is not coddling, it's not enabling, it is in fact a great act of kindness. So just treat it like an experiment, right? See what happens if you give your loved one what they're asking for. See what happens if you meet them where they are. Are they going to move the goalpost, or is it going to start to feel like you're turning the tide? Remember the Coleman data we talked about at the way beginning of the episode? Coleman found in his research that the most commonly cut off family member is a divorced dad who's cut off from his adult kids. So if this is your story, if you are listening to me right now and you are the divorced dad whose adult kids are pulling away, you might be caught in this incredibly tricky triangle between your adult kids and your intimate partner or your spouse, especially if your family blended when your kids were adults. The blending can be so slow and so difficult. My recommendation for you is to resource yourself with a therapist who can help you figure out how you can advocate for your kids with your spouse and how you can advocate for your spouse with your kids. You are the fulcrum, you're kind of the center point of this really emotional system. And you need and deserve support so that you can become a relational leader, so that you can begin to model grace and curiosity and accountability and hope for a new chapter. And I will tell you that problems like this tend to take on a life of their own. They tend to become more, not less, entrenched with every passing holiday and every passing family milestone. So do not for a second underestimate your power, resource yourself, and see, how to begin to create a vision of relational leadership where you can start to model, okay, we aren't the family that we used to be, but that doesn't mean that we are worthless, doesn't mean this is impossible. We can start to create a new trail together. Okay, question 3. Can I get to know my loved one as they are today? So check in with yourself. To what degree are you seeing your loved one for the person they are today versus perhaps holding on to an outdated story of who that person used to be? Do you need to update your view of this person? Especially if the person who is cutting themselves off from you is your own kid. You have all kinds of memories of them as a kid, as a toddler, as a teen, as a young adult. It is our job as parents to constantly kind of update our story of who our kid is, where they're at now, what they're perhaps capable of now that they weren't capable of before. So Lead with curiosity. See if you can really understand them for their struggle or for their concern as it shows up today. Rather than feeling stuck like, here we go again, see what happens if you listen, if you force yourself to listen for what is new or different in this set of concerns. What's different now than what you perhaps heard from them 3 or 5 or 10 years ago? And if you can offer that to your family member, then maybe they can start to do the same for you. Maybe they can start to get to know you today as the person that you are today, because you also are not the same person that you were 3 or 5 or 10 years ago. We are all forever moving targets, but especially in these lifelong relationships, it's very easy to get stuck inside of an old frame. Okay, as we wrap up today's show, just a final reminder that I created a companion worksheet for you that goes with this episode. It's designed to help you integrate all of what we covered today. If you're a newsletter subscriber, it's going to be waiting for you in your inbox, and we'll make sure we pop it into the next couple of newsletters. And if you're not a newsletter subscriber, head to dralexandrasolomon.com/cutoff and sign up today. And you're going to receive the worksheet in your inbox. Family dynamics are so complex. They are forged in this mix of history and tradition and obligation and loyalty and fondness and love and memory and possibility and care. And all these relationships are alive. They ebb, they flow, they require work, they require bandwidth that we don't always have. And a cutoff might reflect that the work that's needed far exceeds the resources that are available. And a cutoff is an act of self-preservation. But I hope that today's episode has offered you some tools or a perspective that opens up a shade of gray between passive tolerance of an unhealthy status quo and walking away. And if you're the person who's being cut off, I hope this conversation helps you feel brave enough and humble enough to open your heart and turn toward your loved one's pain. Let them take the lead. Let them show you the map of their hurt. That is also a great act of love. And do not for a moment underestimate the power of bearing witness. Recognition and presence can become a powerful foundation for a next act. Okay, until next time, be well. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening, and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.